They thought I wouldn't show up. That was the first thing my mother whispered to my sister when I walked into that courtroom, and I remember the exact way her voice dropped, like she was adjusting reality to fit what she wanted it to be, like I was still the version of me they had erased years ago. The room itself was colder than I expected. Polished wood, quiet murmurs, the soft shuffle of legal folders being opened and closed and across the aisle. My father sat straight-backed in a dark suit that probably cost more than my first apartment. Rachel beside him, fingers laced together like this, was already finished, like this was just a formality. And I stood there for a second longer than necessary, letting the silence settle, letting them look at me the way people look at something that isn't supposed to be there, something inconvenient. If you've ever been written out of your own story by the people who were supposed to protect you, you'll understand exactly what that moment feels like. And before we go any further, I want to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Drop it in the comments, and if stories like this resonate with you, make sure you subscribe. Because what happened next didn't just change my life, it rewrote everything they thought they controlled. I didn't walk in angry, I didn't walk in shaking, I walked in prepared, because this didn't start in a courtroom. It started years earlier with a single document they thought I would never see. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and 2 years ago my parents transferred my inheritance to my older sister. Without telling me, not with a conversation, not with an explanation, just signatures, dates, and a quiet assumption that I wouldn't fight it, that I wouldn't even understand it. They didn't take it loudly. There was no confrontation, no argument at the kitchen table, just a folder, a bank transfer, and a legal filing that removed me from something that had been mine since the day my grandfather signed it into existence. I found out the way people like me always do accidentally: a misplaced envelope, a line item that didn't make sense, a number that had been moved somewhere it didn't belong. And when I realized what they had done, I didn't call them, I didn't confront them, I didn't cry, I just made a copy. That was the moment everything shifted. Not when they signed it away, but when I understood exactly how they did it. Because paperwork tells a story if you read it closely enough, and I had spent enough time being invisible to learn how to notice what other people overlook. Across the courtroom, my father leaned toward his attorney, whispering something with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you've already won. And Rachel didn't even look at me. She was staring straight ahead, calm, composed, like the outcome had already been decided in her favor months ago. I took my seat, placed my folder on the table in front of me, and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the edges of every document I had spent the last year collecting, organizing, understanding. I said nothing because I didn't need to, not yet. They thought this was about money. They thought this was about me wanting something back, but it wasn't. It was about something much simpler than that. It was about proving that what they did wasn't just unfair, it was wrong. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let them decide what that meant. The clerk called the room to order. The judge entered, and as everyone stood, I glanced once more across the aisle at the family that had erased me on paper and expected me to stay that way. And I understood something with absolute clarity in that moment. They hadn't lost anything yet. Not technically, not officially. But they were about to, because the one thing they never accounted for wasn't my anger. It was my patience, and patience, when it's backed by evidence, changes everything. I did not always understand what I was looking at, but I understood enough to know that something was wrong the moment I saw my name missing where it should have been printed in full. The document was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was just a clean, structured report from the trust account numbers aligned in neat columns, dates stamped in precise rows, and one transfer that did not belong. A transfer that moved everything from my name into Rachel's without a single notification reaching me. I remember sitting at a small desk in my apartment, the kind with a surface barely large enough for a laptop and a stack of papers, staring at that line for a long time, not reacting, just reading it again and again until the meaning settled into something solid. It did not look like betrayal, it looked like administration, and that was what made it worse. I opened the envelope. It came in more carefully than necessary, flattening the edges as if the paper itself might reveal something if I handled it correctly. And that was when I saw the second detail, the notice date 2 weeks earlier sent an address I had not lived at in over 3 years. They had not just moved the money, they had redirected the information. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. This was not a mistake. This was planned. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found my father's name, and I stared at it for a few seconds, my thumb hovering just above the screen. Then I locked the phone and set it down. I did not call. I did not ask. I did not give them the chance to explain something that had already been executed. Instead, I opened my laptop and started searching not for answers but for patterns, account statements, transaction logs, prior filings. Anything that could show me how this had been done and who had authorized it. Hours passed without me noticing the outside light shifting from afternoon to evening, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Every document told the same story: clean, efficient, intentional. My father had signed as custodian, my mother had been listed as secondary witness, and Rachel's name appeared exactly where mine used to be, as if it had always belonged there. I printed everything. Not just the summary, but every page, every line, every timestamp. I stacked them neatly on the desk, aligning the corners until they formed a perfect square. I did not feel angry, not yet. Anger would have made me act too soon. What I felt was clarity. I reached for a pen and wrote one word at the top of the first page copy. Then I made another set and another, placing each into separate folders. I understood something important in that moment. Something that would define everything that came after. If they had used paper to erase me, then paper would be the only thing that could bring me back. I stood up, walked to the small filing cabinet by the window, and slid the first folder inside, closing the drawer with a quiet, deliberate motion. I said nothing to anyone, not to my parents, not to Rachel, not to the extended family, who would later talk about generosity and fairness, without knowing what had actually happened. I stayed silent, not because I did not have a voice, but because I had finally learned when not to use it. Silence, when used correctly, is not weakness. It is preparation. And from that night forward, everything I did was no longer about understanding what they had taken. It was about proving how they had taken it and making sure that when the time came, there would be no room left for denial. The next time I saw my parents was not at a dinner table or a holiday gathering. It was in their living room on a Sunday afternoon, the same room where everything had always been decided without ever being discussed, the same beige couch, same polished coffee table, the same framed photos on the wall where Rachel stood in the center of almost every image while I existed somewhere at the edge or not at all. My mother was arranging flowers when I walked in, white lilies in a glass vase, trimming the stems with careful, precise movements, and my father sat in his usual chair with a newspaper folded in half, reading like nothing in the world had shifted. Rachel was there too, sitting cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely at ease, like she belonged to a version of the family that had never been questioned. I stood near the doorway for a moment, taking it in the quiet normalcy of a space that had quietly rewritten my place in it. No one looked surprised to see me, which told me everything I needed to know. They were not worried. They were not expecting a confrontation. They had already decided how this would go. "You should have called before coming," my mother said, without looking up, her voice calm, almost polite, as if this was about manners and not something much larger. I nodded slightly and stepped further into the room, placing my bag on the floor beside the chair I used to sit in, the one that had been moved slightly to the side to make space for a new lamp. I was in the area, I said, keeping my tone, even measured the way I had practiced in my head. My father folded his newspaper slowly and set it aside, finally looking at me with the same expression he used when reviewing something he had already decided on. "Is there something you need, Emily?" he asked, and there it was, the framing, not what happened, not why I was there, just whether I needed something. As if I was the one making a request. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said, and I let the words sit there, simple, controlled. Rachel glanced up for a second, her eyes meeting mine briefly, before returning to her screen, uninterested, unaffected. I watched her for a moment, the ease in her posture, the quiet confidence of someone who had been handed something and never had to question how it arrived. My mother placed the vase in the center of the table and stepped back, adjusting one of the stems until it sat exactly where she wanted it. "If this is about the trust," she said, finally turning toward me, her tone shifting just slightly, "your father and I made the decision we believed was best for the family." The family. I repeated the phrase silently in my head, the way it had always been used to justify things that only benefited one person. I nodded again slowly, as if I was processing something new, even though I already knew more than they thought. "I understand," I said, and I meant it not in the way they expected, but in a way that had nothing to do with agreement. My father leaned back in his chair, satisfied, like the conversation had already reached its conclusion. "Rachel has plans," he continued, gesturing slightly toward her. "This will help her build something real." I followed his gesture, looking at my sister, who did not respond, who did not need to respond. I could have said it then. I could have mentioned the address, changed the notice date, the signatures, every detail I had already documented, but I did not. I let them finish. I let them believe that this moment was enough. I picked up my bag, stepped back toward the doorway, and paused just long enough to look at all three of them, memorizing the scene exactly as it was. "That makes sense," I said quietly, and then I left. I did not slam the door. I did not look back. I did not give them anything they could react to. Outside, the air felt sharper, clearer, like something had finally settled into place. They thought they had explained it. They thought I had accepted it. What they did not realize was that I had just confirmed everything I needed, not through what they said, but through what they did not say. And from that point on, there was no confusion left, only timing. The next phase did not happen in a single moment. It happened in small, deliberate steps that no one in my family ever noticed because they were not looking for them. I did not change my routine in any obvious way. I still went to work, still answered messages, still showed up to the occasional family gathering when it was unavoidable. And every time I walked into those spaces, I played the same role. They expected quiet, agreeable, unbothered. Rachel talked about her plans openly now. About investments, about expansion, about opportunities that suddenly existed because of resources she had never earned, and my parents listened with the kind of pride that used to be reserved for achievements, not transfers. I watched it all without interrupting, without correcting, without revealing that I already knew more about those resources than any of them did. At night, my routine was different. I would sit at my desk with the folders spread out in front of me, each document placed in a specific order, each detail cross-referenced, each signature compared to previous filings. I learned how the trust had been structured, how authority had been assigned, and more importantly, where that authority ended. There was a clause buried deep in the original agreement, a clause that most people would not read twice, a clause that only mattered under very specific circumstances. And the more I studied it, the more I realized something my parents clearly had not. They had followed the process, but they had not followed the intent. I did not react to that realization with excitement or relief. I treated it like everything else, as information to be verified. I reached out to the bank, listed on the transfer documents, not with accusations, but with questions framed as clarification. I requested copies, confirmations, timelines. I spoke to people who did not know my family, who did not care about our dynamics, only about whether procedures had been followed correctly. Each conversation added another piece to the structure I was building, another confirmation that what had been done could be undone under the right conditions. I kept records of everything, every email, every response, every document that passed through my hands. I printed them, dated them, filed them. During the day, I remained exactly who they thought I was. At night, I became something else entirely. Someone patient, someone precise. Someone who understood that this was no longer about a single transfer, it was about a system that had been used incorrectly. Weeks turned into months, and nothing outward changed. My parents never asked if I had questions, never checked if I understood, because in their minds there was nothing left to explain. They had already justified it, already closed the subject. Rachel moved forward with her plans, signing documents, making decisions, building something on a foundation she believed was secure. I let her. I let all of them continue exactly as they were because interruption would have only made them careful, and careful people do not leave evidence. I needed them to stay confident. I needed them to believe that silence meant acceptance. Every time my phone lit up with a family message, every time I sat at a table where my name was no longer part of the conversation, I reminded myself of one simple fact. They had already made their move. Now I was making mine. And unlike them, I was not in a hurry. I was building something that did not rely on emotion or explanation. I was building a case. And cases, when done correctly, do not need to be loud. They only need to be right. The shift did not begin with a confrontation. It began with a phone call. I was not supposed to receive a number. I did not recognize appearing on my screen on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something about the timing made me answer. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a compliance officer from the financial institution that had processed the transfer, his tone professional, neutral, the kind of voice that does not carry emotion, only information. He asked if I was available to confirm a few details regarding an account previously associated with my name, and I could feel the subtle change in the structure I had been building, like a piece finally moving on its own. I confirmed. My identity kept my answers short, precise, and listened. He explained that there had been a routine internal review, nothing unusual, nothing urgent, but during that review, a discrepancy had been flagged regarding notification procedures tied to a custodial transfer. The word discrepancy stayed with me. I asked one question, simple, controlled. What kind of discrepancy? And there was a pause, not long, just enough to suggest that he was choosing his words carefully. The required notification was sent, but not to the beneficiary's current address, he said, and I closed my eyes for a second, not out of shock, but because hearing it confirmed out loud changed its weight. It was no longer something I had discovered, it was something the system had acknowledged. I thanked him, told him I would be willing to provide any documentation if needed, and ended the call without asking anything more. I did not need to. That one confirmation was enough. I walked to my desk, opened the top drawer, and took out the primary folder, the one that contained everything in its most complete form. I placed it on the table and opened it slowly, turning to the section where I had documented the address, changed the notice date, the timeline that connected them. I added a new page, writing the date of the call, the name of the officer, and a summary of what had been said. Then, I placed it neatly into the sequence. It was acknowledged, I said quietly. Not to anyone, just to the room, just to the structure I had been building for months. That evening, my phone lit up with a message from Rachel, casual, almost careless, asking if I could review something for her. A document she did not fully understand, something related to an investment she was about to finalize. I stared at the message for a few seconds, then opened it. The attachment loaded slowly, a multi-page agreement filled with terms she had never needed to question before. I read it carefully, line by line, not because she had asked, but because it gave me something else. Another layer, another example of how she moved through systems she did not fully understand. I typed back a short response, neutral, helpful, exactly what she expected from me. You might want to double-check clause 12, I wrote, then set my phone down. I was not helping her, not really. I was observing her. The more she moved, the more she signed, the more she built on top of what they had transferred, the clearer the structure became. And structures, when built on flawed foundations, do not fail immediately. They hold just long enough for everything above them to settle into place. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the folder in front of me, at the pages that now carried not just suspicion but confirmation. They still believed nothing had changed. They still believed the decision they made months ago was final. But something had shifted quietly, precisely, and for the first time since this began, it was not just me who knew it. The system had started to notice too. And once a system notices, it does not forget. The moment I decided to move forward, I did not announce it, I formalized it. There is a difference between knowing you are right and proving it in a way that cannot be ignored, and that difference is process. I scheduled the consultation on a Wednesday morning, early, before work, choosing a firm that specialized in trust disputes and fiduciary obligations, not because I needed someone to tell me what had happened, but because I needed someone who could translate what I had into something the system would recognize as actionable. The office was quiet glass walls, clean lines, a reception desk that felt more like a checkpoint than a welcome. And when they called my name, I carried my folder the same way I had carried it for months, steady, organized, complete. The attorney introduced himself as Michael Green, mid-40s, measured tone, the kind of presence that does not waste words. He did not ask for a summary, he asked for documents, and I placed the folder on the table between us, opening it to the first section without explanation. He read in silence page after page, occasionally marking something with a small note, occasionally pausing just long enough to reread a line, and I watched his expression, not looking for approval but for recognition. "You kept everything," he said, finally, not as a question. I nodded. "I documented it," I replied. He leaned back slightly, hands resting on the table, and for the first time since I sat down, he looked directly at me. "This is not just about a transfer," he said. "This is about whether the transfer complied with the duties attached to that account." I let the words settle. That was exactly the line I had been building toward. He continued outlining the structure in clear terms: fiduciary responsibility, proper notification, beneficiary rights. Each concept aligning with the documents I had already organized. If the notification was not properly delivered, he said, the entire action can be challenged, potentially reversed, depending on how the court interprets intent and execution. I did not react outwardly. I had already understood that possibility, but hearing it framed within the system gave it weight. "What would you need from me?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He tapped the folder lightly. "What you have is strong," and he said, "but we need to formalize it: affidavits, certified copies, a clear timeline that shows not just what happened, but how it deviated from required procedure." I nodded. "I can provide that." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, in return the kind that signals alignment. "Then we file," he said simply. "Filing." The word did not sound dramatic, it sounded procedural, almost routine, but I understood what it represented. It was the point where everything moved from preparation to action. I left the office with a list not of emotions but of tasks, items, to gather statements, to formalize records, to request in certified form. That afternoon I contacted the bank again, this time, requesting official copies. I drafted a personal statement outlining the timeline, from my perspective, precise, factual, without exaggeration. I reached out to confirm address records, ensuring that the discrepancy was documented not just by me but by independent sources. Each step was methodical, each piece placed exactly where it needed to be. I did not tell my family. I did not hint at what was happening. To them, nothing had changed. To me, everything had. Weeks later, when the documents were complete, when every page had been reviewed, signed, and prepared, I sat across from Michael again as he slid the final set of papers toward me. "Once this is filed," he said, "it becomes part of the record." I placed my hand on the top page, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this point, not heavy, not overwhelming, just final. "That is the point," I said quietly. I picked up the pen, signed my name in full, and in that moment, the silence I had held for months was no longer absence. It had become evidence. The first sign that something had shifted reached them before it reached me. Not because I moved too fast, but because systems do not move quietly once they are engaged. 3 days after the filing was officially recorded, my phone lit up with my father's name, and I let it ring twice before answering, just long enough to remind myself that this conversation was no longer about permission. It was about position. "Emily," he said, his voice controlled but tighter than usual. "We received a notice this morning," and I could hear the paper in his hand, the slight rustle of something that had interrupted his version of order. "I assumed you would," I replied, keeping my tone even, almost neutral, and there was a pause on the line, not confusion, but recalibration. He was adjusting to a version of me he had not accounted for. "This is unnecessary," he continued, the word chosen carefully, like he was framing the situation as excessive rather than incorrect. "If you had questions, you could have come to us directly." I looked at the window in front of me, at the reflection of someone he clearly did not recognize anymore. "I did," I said calmly. "You answered." Silence followed, not long, but enough to shift the balance. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take when they realize something is no longer within their control. "You are misunderstanding the situation," he said, and I almost smiled at how predictable that sounded. Misunderstanding, not violation, not mistake, just a framing that placed the error on me. "Then the court will clarify it," I replied, and I did not raise my voice. I did not add anything else because I did not need to. The line went quiet again, and this time when he spoke, the confidence had thinned. "This could affect your sister," he said, and there it was, the real concern, not the process, not the legality, but the impact on Rachel. I let that sit for a moment before responding. "It already did," I said, and then I ended the call before he could redirect it. Within an hour, my mother called, her approach different, softer, almost careful, like she was stepping into unfamiliar ground. "Emily, we should talk about this," she said, her tone carrying a hint of urgency she would never admit to. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the folder that had now become something official, something that existed beyond conversation. "There is nothing to talk about," I replied. And I could hear the shift on her end the moment she realized this was not a discussion she could guide. "This is family," she insisted, quietly, as if the word still held authority. "This is documented," I answered, and I kept my voice steady. Not cold, not emotional, just final. She did not respond immediately, and in that silence, I understood something clearly. They were not prepared for this version of me, not because I had changed suddenly, but because I had stopped explaining myself. Later that evening, Rachel sent a message shorter than usual, direct, asking what I was doing and why, and I read it without replying, placing the phone down beside me as the screen dimmed. I did not owe her an explanation, not now, not in this phase. Explanations were for conversations, and this was no longer one. Over the next few days, more messages came, some from extended family, some from people who had only heard one side of the story, all carrying the same undertone. That I was escalating something that should have remained private. I did not respond to any of them. I did not correct the narrative. I did not defend my position. I let them talk because narratives do not change outcomes, records do. And for the first time since this began, the pressure was no longer on me to prove something. It had shifted to them to justify something that had already been filed, already been reviewed, already been set into motion. They thought this was conflict. I knew it was procedure, and procedure, once it begins, does not ask for permission to continue. By the time the hearing date was set, everything had already been positioned exactly where it needed to be. Not just the documents, but the narrative each side believed they were bringing into the room. My parents approached it the way they approached everything, confident, controlled, certain that what they had done could be explained if necessary, and more importantly, justified. Rachel followed their lead. Her messages had stopped by then, replaced by silence that felt less like distance and more like calculation. I did not try to interpret it. I focused on structure. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, I met with Michael twice more, each meeting shorter than the last, because there was less to clarify and more to confirm. We reviewed the timeline in full, from the original trust formation to the transfer to the misdirected notification to the internal acknowledgement from the bank. Every detail aligned. Every document supported the next. They will try to frame this as a family decision. Michael said during our final meeting, his tone steady, analytical. They will emphasize intent over execution. I nodded because I had expected that. Intent was easier to defend than process. And the court will focus on procedure, I replied, and he gave a small nod in return, not approval, but agreement. The morning of the hearing, I arrived early, not out of anxiety, but because I prefer to see a room before it fills, to understand its layout before it becomes active. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. less dramatic than the version people. Imagine rows of wooden benches, a raised platform, a clerk's desk. Nothing excessive, nothing designed to impress. I took my seat at the front, placed my folder on the table, and opened it to the first section. Not because I needed to review it, but because routine matters. Across the room, my parents entered together, my father in the same controlled posture, my mother slightly behind him, her expression composed but tighter than before. Rachel followed her steps, slower, more deliberate, and for the first time since this began, she looked at me directly, not dismissive, not indifferent, but searching, as if trying to understand what had shifted. I held her gaze for a second, then looked back down at the documents in front of me. There was nothing left to explain. When their attorney approached, he carried a thinner folder than mine, his movements confident, his tone professional, as he exchanged brief words with Michael. I listened without engaging, letting the room settle into its rhythm. When the proceedings began, it unfolded exactly as expected. Introductions, summaries, positions stated clearly on the record. Their side spoke first, framing the transfer as a strategic decision made in good faith, emphasizing family alignment, long-term planning. The idea that authority had been exercised responsibly. I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, my posture still. I let them finish. When it was our turn, Michael did not start with emotion. He started with sequence, walking the court through the timeline, step by step, document by document, not arguing, just presenting. I watched as the narrative shifted not dramatically, but incrementally, from intention to execution, from explanation to requirement. When he reached the notification, he paused just long enough to let the detail settle: the address, the date, the confirmation from the institution itself. I did not look at my parents. I did not react. I kept my focus forward because this was not about their response. It was about the record. And once something enters the record, it does not rely on interpretation. It stands on its own. I had spent months preparing for this moment, not to speak, not to confront, but to ensure that when the system examined what had happened, it would see it clearly, without distortion, without omission. And as the judge reviewed the documents in front of him, turning each page with measured attention, I understood that the outcome was no longer something I needed to influence. It was something that had already been built into the evidence itself. The judge did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than anything that had been said in the last hour, because in that silence, every document, every date, every signature had already been considered. I sat still, my hands resting on the table, my eyes forward, not looking at my parents, not looking at Rachel, because I already knew what was behind me. I had seen it for years. When the judge finally began, his voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone that does not react, only concludes. He did not reference emotion. He did not acknowledge family dynamics. He focused on sequence, on obligation, on whether the actions taken aligned with the responsibilities attached to them. He outlined the trust structure, the authority granted to my father as custodian, the requirement of proper notification, and then he paused briefly at that point, just long enough for it to settle into the room. The court finds, he continued, that the notification requirement was not satisfied in a manner consistent with the governing terms of the trust, and that was it. No raised voice, no dramatic shift, just a sentence that changed everything. Across the aisle, I could feel the stillness before I saw it. My mother's posture tightening, my father leaning forward slightly, as if proximity could change what had already been stated, and Rachel, for the first time, no longer composed. Her expression fixed in a way that suggested she was trying to process something that did not align with what she had been told. The judge continued, explaining that the failure to properly notify invalidated the transfer, that the action could not stand under the conditions it had been executed, and that the assets were to be restored to their original designation, pending any future compliant action. Restore. The word landed clean, precise, final. I did not react outwardly. I did not smile. I did not look relieved, because this was not a surprise. It was confirmation. Everything I had built had led to this exact conclusion. Their attorney spoke briefly, attempting to reframe to request consideration of intent, but the judge did not shift. The procedure had already been established as the standard, and the record supported it. When the session ended, the room began to move again, quiet conversations, papers being gathered, chairs shifting against the floor. I closed my folder slowly, aligning the edges of the documents the same way I had done from the beginning, and when I finally stood, I allowed myself one glance across the aisle. My father did not meet my eyes. My mother looked at me as if seeing something unfamiliar, and Rachel held my gaze for a second longer than before, not with confidence, not with dismissal, but with something closer to understanding. I did not say anything to them. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, the door closing behind me with a soft, almost unremarkable sound, and as I stepped into the hallway, I understood something with complete clarity. They did not lose because I fought harder, they lost because they assumed I would not fight at all. If you have ever been in a situation where your voice was ignored until you proved it mattered. Comment number 1, if you have ever seen something like this happen to someone else. Comment number 2, and if you hope you never have to stand in a place like this, comment number 3, or share your own thoughts, because stories like this are not rare. They are just rarely told from the side that stayed silent long enough to win.